I'm 91. I've buried my wife, my son, and my best friend. Here's why I still wake up early. Most people think the hard part is the dying. It isn't. The hard part is the morning after, when the sun comes up anyway. You have to decide whether you're going to get up or not. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 91 years old. I have buried my wife, my son, and my best friend. Every morning I wake up at 5:15, before the light, before the birds, before anyone on my street has any reason to be conscious. I sit in a house that used to be full of noise. Now it's so quiet I can hear the clock in the hallway ticking from 2 rooms away. People ask me why. They ask it gently, the way you ask someone a question when you're not sure you want the answer. Why do you still get up so early, Walter? What's the point? I understand why they ask, because from the outside, my life looks like a man sitting alone, in a kitchen drinking coffee in the dark. If that's all it was, they'd be right to wonder. But it isn't all it is. It has never been all it is. I was born in 1935 in a town called Braddock, just outside of Pittsburgh. The steel mills ran 3 shifts. The sky was the color of a bruise most days, and nobody complained because the mills were the reason any of us had shoes on our feet. My father worked at the Edgar Thomson Works, U.S. Steel, for 38 years. When he came home, his hands were so rough. They felt like sandpaper when he touched your face. It was rare, but you remembered it. His hands carried the weight to keep us alive. My mother was a small woman with a big voice who ran the house like a general runs a campaign, with absolute authority. No tolerance for nonsense. She loved us in that fierce, practical way. She fed you, clothed you, corrected you, expected you to amount to something. If you asked if she loved you, she'd look at you like you'd lost your mind. There were 4 of us kids. I was the second oldest. My brother, Frank, 2 years ahead. My sisters, Dorothy and June, came after. We shared bedrooms, bathrooms, hand-me-down clothes, and a single bicycle we fought over with passionate intensity. Only children who have very little can bring that to the ownership of a single object. We were not poor in the desperate way, but poor in the way most people in Braddock were poor. Enough to survive, not much more. The difference is enormous when living it, invisible when looking back from 80 years. I met my wife, Ruth, in 1956 at a dance hall in McKeesport. I was 21, she was 19. She wore a blue dress I can still see. Not because the dress was remarkable, but the woman inside it was. Ruth had dark hair and dark eyes, and a way of looking at you that made you feel she could see past what you were showing the world, into the real thing, the thing you were trying to protect. I asked her to dance. She said yes. I held her hand, small and warm. I thought, this is it. This is the person. And I was right. I was right about very few things with certainty, but I was right about that. We got married in 1958, a small ceremony at St. Brendan's. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on Talbot Avenue. For the first year, we were so happy it felt almost dangerous, like we were getting away with something that couldn't possibly last. But it did last. It lasted 49 years. Not because we were perfect, or because we never fought, or had some secret. It lasted because we decided, separately and together, over and over again, that it was going to last. We made that decision on good days, bad days, and ordinary days. That accumulation of small decisions is what a marriage actually is when you strip away everything else. Our son, David, was born in 1960. He was our only child, not by choice, but by circumstance. Ruth had complications. Doctors said another pregnancy would be dangerous. So David became everything. I don't mean we spoiled him, though we probably did. He became the center of the household, the axis around which everything else turned. When you have one child, that child carries a weight that gets distributed more evenly. When there are siblings, the weight of all your hopes and fears and unlived possibilities. David carried that weight with grace. I didn't fully appreciate until he was gone. He was a good boy. I know every parent says that, and good is so broad. It barely means anything, but I don't know how else to say it. He was kind. He was curious. He had Ruth's eyes and my stubbornness, and a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest and filled whatever room he was in. He played baseball in high school. Not well enough to go anywhere with it, but well enough to love it. I went to every game and sat in the bleachers and watched him. I felt something that must be close to what people mean by joy, though I wouldn't have used that word. We said, he did good out there. That was our version of joy. David went to college at Pitt, the first in our family. He studied engineering. He got a job at Westinghouse and married Karen, who was smart and funny and loved him the way Ruth loved me, with her whole self, without reservation, without a safety net. They had 2 daughters, Emily and Claire. For a while, in the late 80s and early 90s, our family felt complete. Most people spend their lives hoping for this. Only some people get to experience it. Sunday dinners at our house. Thanksgiving with too many people in the kitchen. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper on the floor. Girls running between rooms. Ruth standing in the doorway, watching, with an expression I can only describe as satisfied, not smiling exactly, but settled, like a person who has arrived at the place they were always trying to reach. I need to tell you about my best friend, because he's part of this story. In a way, I can't separate from the rest of it. His name was Eugene Kowalski. Everyone called him Gene. I met him on my first day at the mill in 1953, when I was 18 and terrified. Gene was 20. He'd been working there for 2 years. He took one look at me and said, "You look like you're about to pass out. Come on, I'll show you the water." That was it. That was the beginning of a friendship that lasted 53 years, longer than most marriages, most careers, longer than some people's entire lives. Gene was the kind of friend I don't think exists anymore, or maybe I just can't see it, because I'm old and everything looks different from this far away. Gene and I didn't have to work at being friends. We didn't have to schedule time, or make plans, or talk about feelings. We just were. We worked the same shift for 22 years. We bowled on the same league. We fished together. The fishing wasn't the point. The point was sitting next to someone who knew you so well. That silence was comfortable. You could go 20 minutes without saying a word, and it didn't mean anything was wrong. It just meant you were both watching the water and thinking your own thoughts, and that was enough. Gene's wife, Marlene, and Ruth became close. The 4 of us spent decades moving through life in a loose formation, close enough to rely on each other, but far enough apart to have our own lives. We went on vacations. We celebrated holidays. When Gene's mother died, I drove him to the funeral home, sat with him while he picked out the casket. He didn't cry, but his hands were shaking. I put my hand on his shoulder, left it there. Neither of us said anything, because there was nothing to say that the hand on the shoulder didn't already say. The first loss came in 2003. David was 43 years old. He had a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in April, at his desk at work. By the time the paramedics got there, he was gone. 43 years old. His daughters were in high school. Karen called us from the hospital. Ruth answered the phone. I watched her face change, from normal to something I had never seen before. Hope I never see again. A kind of collapse that happened from the inside out, as if the structure that held her face together had been removed. She didn't scream. She made a sound that was worse than screaming, a low, broken sound from somewhere so deep inside her. She didn't even know it was there until that moment. And then she looked at me and said, "David," and I knew. I knew before she said anything else. I am not going to describe the grief of losing a child in detail, because I don't think language is capable of it. Even now, 23 years later, there are parts of it that I can't touch without feeling like I'm falling. When your child dies before you, something happens to your understanding of time. The future you assumed would unspool in a certain order, with you going first and your children carrying on after. That future is revealed to be something you invented, a story you told yourself because the alternative was too terrifying. When the alternative happens, you are left standing in a world that no longer follows the rules you thought it followed. You have to decide whether you're going to keep living in that world or not. Ruth and I kept living. We kept living because we had each other and because we had Emily and Claire. David would have wanted us to, which is a thing people say that sounds hollow until you realize it's true. The people we loved continue to exist inside us as a set of values and expectations and hopes. Honoring those is not sentimental. It is the most practical thing in the world. David would have wanted his mother to keep making her lemon cake on Sundays. David would have wanted his father to keep going to the hardware store on Saturday mornings, talking to the men there about nothing in particular. David would have wanted us to keep being the people he knew, because those people were his home, and if we stopped being them, then he lost his home twice. But Ruth was never the same. I don't mean she was diminished, because she wasn't. She was still strong, still sharp, still capable of making me laugh at the dinner table. But there was a room inside her that she went into sometimes, a room I couldn't follow her into. When she was in that room, she was with David, and I was on the outside. I learned to wait for her to come back without asking where she'd been, because asking would have made it worse. Ruth died in 2007, 4 years after David. She had pancreatic cancer, and it moved fast. From diagnosis to death was 11 weeks. 11 weeks. I had 49 years with her. Then I had 11 weeks of watching her leave, and the cruelty of that arithmetic is something I will never make peace with. Not because I'm bitter, but because some things are simply too large to fit inside the word acceptance. I sat with her every day in the hospital. I held her hand, which was still small, still warm, even at the end. I talked to her about things that didn't matter, about the weather, about what the girls were doing, about a bird I'd seen in the yard that morning, because I wanted her last days to be filled with ordinary life, not with the heaviness of goodbye. She died on a Thursday afternoon in October. The last thing she said to me was, "Don't forget to eat, Walter," which was such a Ruth thing to say that I laughed. And then I cried, and then I sat there holding her hand for a long time after she was gone, because I didn't know how to let go of something I'd been holding for half a century. After Ruth died, Gene saved my life. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it literally. Without him, I'm not sure I would have continued to get up in the morning. When you're 72 years old, and you've lost your son and your wife within 4 years of each other, not getting up in the morning is a real possibility, not as a decision, but as a slow surrender. A gradual giving in to the weight of everything that's been taken from you. Gene came to my house every morning at 6 o'clock. He didn't call first. He didn't ask if I wanted company. He just showed up, the way he'd been showing up for 50 years. He sat at my kitchen table, and he drank my coffee, and he talked about whatever came into his head. The Steelers, the weather, a story he'd read in the paper, and he didn't ask me how I was feeling, because he knew that question was useless, that the answer was obvious, and that saying it out loud wouldn't help. He just sat there. He just was there. And his being there was the rope I held on to, while the current tried to pull me under. Gene did that for 5 years, 5 years of mornings. 6 o'clock, my kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee, conversation about nothing important. And then in 2012, Gene was diagnosed with lung cancer, which was not a surprise to either of us, because he'd smoked for 40 years, and we both knew what that meant. But knowing what something means in the abstract, and knowing what it means when it's happening to your best friend, are 2 entirely different kinds of knowing. Gene fought it for 14 months. I was with him the way he'd been with me, not with grand gestures or profound words, but with presence, with showing up, with sitting in the chair next to his bed at the VA hospital and watching baseball on the television, and arguing about whether the Pirates would ever be good again, which was a conversation we'd been having for 30 years, and which we both knew we were having for the last time, though neither of us said so. Gene died on a Sunday morning in March of 2013. Marlene called me and I drove to the hospital. I sat with him for a while after he was gone, the way I'd sat with Ruth. I looked at his face, which was peaceful in a way that his face had never been in life. Because Gene was always in motion, always talking, always doing something with his hands. And in death he was still, and the stillness was wrong. It was the opposite of everything he'd been. I put my hand on his shoulder one last time, and I said, "Thank you, Gene." And I meant it in a way that I have never meant anything before or since. After Gene died, I was alone. Truly alone, in a way I had never been in my entire life. I was 78 years old. My son was gone. My wife was gone. My best friend was gone. My brother Frank had died of a stroke in 2009. My sister Dorothy was in a nursing home with dementia and didn't recognize me when I visited. June was still alive, but she lived in Florida. We talked on the phone, but it wasn't the same as having someone in the room with you. Someone whose physical presence you could feel. Someone who displaced air and made noise. And reminded you, just by being there, that you were not the last person on earth. I want to tell you about the morning after Gene's funeral, because that was the morning everything changed. Or rather, that was the morning I understood something that had been true all along, but that I hadn't been able to see until everything else had been stripped away. I woke up at 5:15, the way I always do, and I lay in bed and I stared at the ceiling. And I thought, there is no reason to get up. There is no one to get up for. Ruth is not in the kitchen. David is not going to call. Gene is not going to knock on the door at 6 o'clock. The house is empty. The street is dark. The world is going to go on without me, whether I get out of this bed or not, and no one will notice either way. And I lay there for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30, and I felt the pull of that thought, the gravitational force of it, the way it wanted to hold me down. And I understood, in that moment, that this was the most dangerous morning of my life, not because anything was going to happen to me, but because nothing was going to happen to me. And nothing, when you're 78 and alone, is the thing that kills you. Not disease, not accident, not violence, nothing. The absence of reason.